Hello everyone, and our apologies for delay in starting this meeting. My screen appears that it says Peter Sutton, but that is not the case. Our chair unfortunately had some technical trouble, so do apologize for the wait. Kelsey is here today with us to talk about her amazing work in linguistics. So off to you, Kelsey.
Thank you. So I know you're not supposed to start these things with apologies, but you will probably hear me coughing. I'm sorry about that. I don't have COVID anymore, so it's fine. I'm in my second year as a junior research fellow at Jesus College. Previously, I was at University of California, Santa Cruz, and the work that I'm going to talk about today is work that I was involved with mainly when I was there. Although I am still doing bits and bobs right now, despite being far away from all of the relevant people. So here we go. So before I actually get into the project, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, at least for the next hour or so, about what linguistics is, or what I'm considering linguistics here. So the broadest question I guess we could ask is, how could we approach the systematic study of language in the sense of studying it as some sort of scientific object, rather than pursuing learning actually how to speak various languages. So one thing we might think of it as is as a social object, so something in the world whose patterns of use reflect our constructions of identity, community, and power. This is a lot of work in the subfield called sociolinguistics. We could think of it as a historical object, something that there is quite a lot of in the UK and throughout Europe. So as an object whose patterns of change and variation shed light on the history of the peoples of the world. And I always like an excuse to look at this lovely tree of the Indo-European language family, which English is a part of. And we could also think of language as a biological object, which is mainly what we'll be doing today. So that's thinking of language as something whose shared patterns and resilience across our species can shed light on the structure of the human mind in general, and on our shared genetic inheritance. I do just want to note that, thinking of language in these different ways, they're not mutually exclusive with each other, and often they do overlap. So in thinking about language as a biological object, I'm going to make 3 empirically backed claims about language. One is that all human languages are open-ended, extremely complex systems. No one human language is actually less expressive or less logical or less complex than any other. Although it may seem that way at first blush, when you encounter certain languages that you're very unfamiliar with. You may have heard such things about languages from different parts of the world. Unfortunately, a lot of that is rooted in basically racial prejudice or prejudice of some sort. And all humans learn and use a fully fledged linguistic system, so one of those extremely complex things, except in cases of pretty particular injuries or disorders, or in cases of extreme deprivation. And finally, and maybe the most surprisingly, there appears to be a high degree of heterogeneity or variety among the documented human languages. But upon closer examination and comparison of them, the extent of those differences is actually pretty small. And the extent of similarities across languages turns out to be maybe surprisingly high. So one thing we could say along this line is that the number of patterns we can imagine languages to have far exceeds the number of linguistic patterns we know to exist or to have ever existed. So, how can we make sense of all this? So there is a sub-branch of linguistics called, well, it's a different branch, I guess, different branch of linguistics called psycholinguistics, which is the study of how language is processed by and represented in the mind and brain. And it explores the relationships between linguistic factors, such as the order that words come in, or what kind of sounds a language has, and our multi-purpose cognitive capabilities, like our visual system. So the visual system does a lot of things that aren't related to language, like recognizing objects and faces, for example, but it's also involved in things like recognizing words that we're reading. So psycholinguistics is also shedding light on how humans learn and use complex linguistic systems. So I think the intuition that a lot of people have when I try to explain psycholinguistics is that, well, it all seems so obvious. What's so difficult about reading or understanding what somebody's saying to you? And that's because our conscious production and interpretation of language can feel very easy. So it's true once you've learned how to read, which is, you know, quite effortful when you're first learning how to do it as a child. Once you can do it, once you've mastered it, it feels extremely automatic. But there's still a lot of subconscious activity that has to happen to make our conscious experience of language possible. And psycholinguistics is trying to sort of indirectly measure what that subconscious activity is. And finally, it helps us better understand why the known languages don't actually vary in all of the logically possible ways. So, for example, many languages have only 5 distinct vowels. Spanish is one of these. Languages with 5 vowel systems tend to have the vowels E, A, A, O, U, or the vowel sounds, those 5 vowel sounds, or something very close. But there is no language that we've observed that has 5 vowels that go E, I, A, E, A. So this may be due in part to the nature of our auditory system and how our auditory cognition works, and how it interacts with the physical properties of sound and is able to tell apart different sounds or sort of not really tell apart different sounds. So the 5 vowels that we often see in 5 vowel systems are basically the 5 most perceptually different to us. So they sound the most distinct from one another, but the vowel system that we don't see, that I've sort of written down here, is basically a series of vowels that only vary along one dimension. So it's harder for our perceptual system to tell those 5 apart than to tell the other 5 apart, because the other 5 differ in multiple ways. So we can also think about language as a biological object and study it through linguistic fieldwork. So most linguistic research to date focuses on a pretty minuscule subset of the world's languages. So there are about 7,000 languages in the world, but most linguistic research is about these languages listed here. So you'll be seeing a lot of Western European languages and, you know, the big East Asian languages. You may also be noticing that these languages are associated with quite a lot of socioeconomic power throughout the world. That's not an accident. It's not an accident that these are the ones that are most represented in linguistics. So traditional fieldwork aims at, I guess, sort of changing this imbalance by working one-on-one with speakers of the language, usually an underrepresented one, or often an underrepresented one. So to record the words, sentences, narratives, and linguistic intuitions of that language. So traditional fieldwork has a few functions. One of them is simply documentary or descriptive, and the other is analytical, so placing a wider variety of languages in comparison and on equal footing with these big languages listed in the top. So it can both broaden and deepen our understanding of how languages do and do not differ. Even within these relatively well-documented languages, certain methods of fieldwork can reveal pretty subtle patterns in things like meaning and social use. Fieldwork can challenge or support linguistic theories based on very big languages by bringing in data from less represented ones. And it can create language documentation that can be critical to language conservation and revitalization efforts. So you see a lot of this happening in, or I see a lot of this happening in sort of North American linguistics, where there are a lot of linguists out there who are basically doing years-long community-based work with speakers to basically create the resources that might be needed to reconstruct a language if all of the current speakers die without passing the language directly to the next generations. The hope is that that doesn't happen, but you know, it's better to have more information. Okay, and finally, sort of joining these things together, we get field psycholinguistics. So or the goal of psycholinguistics was to sort of uncover possible universals of cognition and things that the human mind, all human minds share, that allows us to understand languages. But how do we know if what we observe in any particular psycholinguistic study actually does reflect something about our shared, probably non-language specific cognitive abilities, rather than just something about how that particular language is processed? So the properties of a particular language maybe cause the mind to come up with some very special mechanism for processing that language, and ones that are very much like it and maybe no others. So the approach is basically sort of very similar to that of traditional fieldwork to traditional, say, formal linguistics. So it's test the same linguistic factors across a range of languages that look fairly different to one another. And that may require that we run experiments in the field instead of in the lab, because a lot of communities can't get to a lab and perhaps don't want to. This is challenging for a lot of reasons. Psycholinguistic equipment is often quite expensive, and sometimes it's difficult or impossible to get outside of a lab. Like an fMRI is a really big machine, very finicky, so it can't be moved. And perhaps more importantly, a group of my professors from UC Santa Cruz did a study of sort of linguistic diversity in psycholinguistics, and it is quite low. And I think a large challenge with this is that the experimental method itself relies on a lot of pretty particular societal norms, like the importance of test taking, being willing and able to focus pretty exclusively on really weird tasks, and some sort of abstract social contract with the experimenter. So it can be really hard to navigate these sort of cultural felicity conditions, they call them, but it can be done. We'll also say that fieldwork should absolutely not be extractive. Ethical fieldwork requires an appropriate exchange and a power balance between researchers, especially outsiders, and the speakers and communities whose languages are being studied. So there are a few ways that this is approached and can be approached responsibly. So what we call community-based or community-driven frameworks are ones in which the research is substantially and possibly completely determined and carried out by community members who are often speakers of the language being studied. And linguists outside the community can serve as resources and consultants for the community actually doing the work. So this model has been, I guess, developed and is still being used in a lot of places, notably MIT and UC Berkeley, which has a lot of archival resources of Native American languages. And the idea is that the academic linguists are sort of part of the toolkit that communities can call upon to revitalize their languages. There are also community engaged frameworks. This is sort of slightly less community involved. So outside researchers are collaborating with community members to ensure that both groups' goals are reached in culturally appropriate ways. So the work that I'm a part of is sort of in the community engaged framework. So the Zapotec Language Project is ongoing community engaged research on Zapotec languages, which are among the indigenous languages of Oaxaca, Mexico. There'll be a map soon, but it's in the south of the country. The project is led by linguists who are currently at and some who were formerly at UC Santa Cruz, and we collaborate closely with Zapotec speakers in both California, which has a large Oaxacan population, and Oaxaca itself. So I want to especially recognize Fe Silva Robles, who is a community leader and a native speaker of Santiago Laxopa Zapotec. So what it will boil down to is that we're very lucky to all meet each other. Otherwise, this wouldn't have been possible. And sort of along the line of what I said earlier about appropriate exchange with the communities that researchers work with. One other thing that was born out of our fieldwork and our scientific research is a community project called Nido de Lenguas, or Language Nest, which is a collaboration between the linguists and a nonprofit organization that Maestra Fe and her sister founded, which serves both the Oaxacan community around Santa Cruz in California and the broader Latino community. And we work together to organize events and create educational resources that share the richness and the value of Oaxacan languages. So here are some pictures of the part of the team that I worked most closely with. There are many more of us. Okay, so onward. So Oaxaca is in the southern part of Mexico. You can see this little pog out here. The yellow bit in the middle we'll get to later. That's where Laxopa is. But for now, it's enough to know where the state is. Oaxaca is quite famous, I guess I'd say, in Mexico and neighboring nations for having a lot of indigenous peoples and indigenous cultures. So officially there are 16 recognized indigenous peoples of Oaxaca. But within those broader groups, there is actually a really high degree of cultural and linguistic diversity, in part because the terrain of that part of the country is extremely mountainous. So there are a lot of villages that are, close together as the crow flies or as the road goes, but quite isolated from each other in practice just because of being in the mountains, or being in the mountains versus down in the valley. And most Oaxacan municipalities are governed by what's called usos y costumbres, which literally means uses and customs, but is actually indigenous customary law. So this is recognized by the federal government of Mexico. In effect, a lot of these communities are semi-autonomous. And in fact, many Oaxacans speak indigenous languages, and many of them are, to this day, monolingual speakers of those indigenous languages. So in Oaxaca, you will find some people who don't speak Spanish. So broadly speaking, there are 16 indigenous Oaxacan languages, which line up with the 16 peoples. And one of them is Zapotec. So they're sort of mapped out here. But as with the other aspects of the cultures of these peoples, each of these languages has a really high degree of internal diversity. So what I mean by that is, for example, Zapotec alone, which is this orange thing that's in much of the middle, Zapotec alone, comprises dozens of varieties. So not all of them are mutually intelligible with one another. What I mean by that is a Zapotec speaker who is from the northern mountains, so sort of on the border of where it says Niche, may be able to understand the Zapotec of the people from the neighboring villages and elsewhere in those same mountains. But if they come down to Oaxaca City, which is in a really wide valley, they will not be able to understand the Zapotec spoken by the people there, even though it's only a 4-hour drive away. So if you go on a 4-hour drive through, say, England, you will notice that the accents change quite a bit, especially depending on which 4 hours you drive. But I think it's unlikely that you'll find that the English spoken 4 hours away from you is completely unintelligible, like completely, even if you try. So the Zapotec language group, so this entire orange area, has about 500,000 speakers, but an individual Zapotec variety, or what we might actually think of as an individual Zapotec language within this bigger group, might have only a handful of living speakers remaining, because they're from a community that was never very big, and there are just fewer of them now, or fewer of them living still in the same community and using Zapotec as opposed to Spanish or something like that. So many Oaxacan languages are in sort of somewhat precarious positions, partly because Indigenous Oaxacans, like many Indigenous people throughout the world, face racism and marginalization. So they get this both within Mexico and in the US. So those who speak Indigenous languages might be under considerable pressure to abandon their languages and their cultures more broadly. But many individuals and communities are dedicated to preserving and celebrating their languages and cultures, both within Oaxaca and people living in diaspora. So one of my professors has noted that, I guess in the recent years, the children of Oaxacan immigrants in California are starting to become college aged. They're becoming our students. Some of them are my students. And a lot of them are interested in learning about their family languages, even though they may not speak them or have much knowledge of them. So there's plenty of appetite for learning and preserving, which is good all around. So the start of our project was in 2016. It was a 10-week field methods class. So students, including myself, met weekly with Maestra Fe, who's in the pink dress in the middle there, to begin documenting various aspects of her language, which is Santiago Laxopa Zapotec, or the Zapotec language spoken in the town of Laxopa. So things we might ask her would pertain to the lexicon or the vocabulary of the language. So we'd say something pretty simple, like how do you say home? How do you say cricket? How do you say corn? Things like that. We studied the grammar. So this is the order of words. So we might ask for something more complex, like a sentence. How do you say the dog chased the cat? And then we would put the words in a different order and ask her if that also formed a sentence or if it was just a word salad, basically. This language also has tones. You might be familiar with tonal languages if you have encountered Mandarin, for example. For English speakers, it can often be very difficult to tell tones apart. So one thing you might ask a speaker like Maestra Fe is, can you hum the word for dog? Because sometimes it's actually difficult to explain in words, the difference between tones, but if you ask somebody to hum it, it just comes out and it sounds a lot more clear to a non-native listener. So a few notable features of Santiago Laxopa Zapotec are these tone and phonation contrasts. So I wasn't able to put the sound in these slides, but I'd be happy to circulate them later along with the recording of this talk, if possible. But important for the experiment that I'll be talking about soon is the normal word order in a sentence of Santiago Laxopa Zapotec. So a normal sentence in this language has the verb first, then the subject, then the object. So if I want to say, if I want to translate, say the English sentence, the woman is pinching the man, into Zapotec, what I would actually say would amount to pinch the woman, the man, right? And so this word order actually can only mean, it only means one thing. The order of these nouns isn't reversible. So if a speaker of Zapotec says to me, well, that I can't understand that to mean that the man is pinching the woman. It only means the woman's pinching the man. Okay, now this is important because, okay, well, I'll get to that. So basic VSO order is shared among all Zapotecan languages, as well as Welsh, Irish, Hawaiian, Chamorro, languages from all over the world, adding up to about 12% of them actually. So this may seem exotic, but in fact, this is the Welsh College, so hopefully it doesn't seem as exotic now. So there are other possible word orders in the language. One of them is familiar to English speakers, and that's where the subject is first, then the verb, then the object. So I can say, and that means the woman is pinching the man, and the order of the words in that sentence is the same as the way we put them in English. But what we can also do without changing the order of the words at all is interpret this as a sentence where the object is first, then the verb in the middle, and then the subject is actually the last thing you encounter. So this same order of words can mean that the man is pinching the woman. And so in English, I have it translated very straightforwardly here, but it might be helpful to think of it as something like, no, it's the woman that the man is pinching, something like that. There's some sort of extra emphasis on the woman, and that's why it's the first thing in the sentence, even though the woman in this case is basically the receiver of the pinching and not the doer of the pinching. So this sentence is ambiguous. It can mean either of these things, but not all sentences with the word order noun, verb, and then some other noun are ambiguous. Okay, here's what I mean by that. So this language also has things called resumptive pronouns. They look like regular pronouns, but what they're actually doing is basically doubling one of the nouns in the sentence. So if I have, right, our woman, pinch, man order again, but I add this little thing to the verb that the pink arrow is pointing to, so that just that little suffix there, the suffix like English past tense is a suffix, then this sentence can only mean one thing. It can now only mean the woman's pinching the man, not the man's pinching the woman. So that little pronoun basically locked the meaning of the sentence to just one thing. And we could do the same to get the other interpretation. We just put the resumptive pronoun in a different place. So this sentence with the pronoun at the end can only mean the man's pinching the woman. So noun, verb, noun sentences that don't have those little resumptive pronouns can have two meanings, right? So the woman doing the pinching or the man doing the pinching. But once you put in the resumptive pronoun, the meaning actually gets locked to only one of those two. Sorry if that's a lot to take in, but we'll be okay. Okay, so we've done our field work, and now we want to link it up with psycholinguistics. So psycholinguistic research broadly has pretty well established that the cognitive processes that humans use to comprehend, that is to understand language, are fast, they're dynamic, and they're predictive. So what do I mean by dynamic? I mean that these processes begin as soon as we start reading or as soon as we start listening. So for example, we don't wait until we hear the end of a sentence to start thinking about what it means. So as I'm talking to you, you are subconsciously going through these processes of understanding what I mean. You're not waiting to hear something that sounds like a period to say, okay, now what does that entire string of preceding sounds that you said actually mean, right? It's a lot to hold on to. So you have to do it as you're getting it, basically. And what do I mean by predictive? So as we're reading or as we're listening, we use our existing linguistic knowledge to predict what's coming up. And this can increase our overall comprehension speed and efficiency, as long as we're good enough at doing these predictions, right? So for example, in English, if we read or hear the word the, we can predict that the next word will be a noun or an adjective, like the cat or the gray cat. It won't be something like a verb. That would be really strange. Okay, so one possible strategy or strategy that psycholinguists have tested is what we'll call the subject preference strategy. So it goes something like this. If, as you're reading or listening to a sentence, you get to a noun that could either be a subject or an object, like the man and the woman we saw before, predict that it will turn out to be the subject. So this means even in the absence of concrete evidence that the noun is the subject or the object, guess, predict. And if you turn out to be right, that'll help you. So if we go back to our sentence and you've just heard the part that goes, I know the woman who, sort of your subconscious, language cognition machine is going, okay, well, this sentence has a subordinate clause, right? That's what who is telling us. It has a relative clause. So woman could either be the subject or the object of that clause. But if I'm employing the subject preference strategy, I'm going to predict it'll be the subject, even though, given just these words that I have so far, I don't know for sure. So if it turns out that the sentence is, I know the woman who is pinching the man, well, the woman is the subject, right? She's the one doing the pinching. So I'm done. This is great. I'm ahead, right? However, if it turns out that the sentence goes, I know the woman who the man is pinching, right now the woman is the object, the receiver of the pinching. So our little cognition machine now has to reevaluate the structure of the sentence and the role that the woman plays in like the pinching event. So the idea is that the woman who's pinching the man is going to be a little bit easier for us, and the woman who the man is pinching will turn out to be harder because we had to fix a mistake. So multiple studies have found that evidence that the subject preference strategy is real. But these studies have only tested a handful of languages, and they're all fairly similar to one another. A lot of them are in the list that I showed you before. So English, Dutch, German, Japanese, and Mandarin, I believe, are on that list as well. So it's not clear just from that if the subject preference strategy is really shared by all humans and it's part of our shared cognitive toolkit, or if it's only a part of how people comprehend those particular languages because of particular features of those languages. So through our fieldwork on Santiago Laxopa Zapotec, we learned that it's actually an ideal language for testing whether the subject preference strategy is universal or language specific. So on to Laxopa. It is in the Sierra Juarez range in Oaxaca Sierra Norte. It has about 1,500 residents and about 1,000 speakers of Santiago Laxopa Zapotec. So here's the zoom in of the state of Oaxaca, and Laxopa is sort of in the central north region. It is extremely mountainous, it's true. So we did this field work in 2018 and 2019. 2020 and 2021, we couldn't go because the town was shut to anyone from outside, which turned out to work. I believe that during that time, nobody in town contracted COVID, which is great. Okay, so the experiment that we ran was a picture matching task with auditory presentation and eye tracking. So I'm going to tell you what each of those things are. So the picture matching task is to choose the picture that depicts the sentence that you've just heard. So show maybe you could be shown more than 2 pictures, but we only have 2 pictures. So why auditory presentation? So this is people listening to a sentence instead of reading it, because like most of the world's languages, Santiago Laxopa Zapotec is predominantly oral, and most of its speakers don't read or write in it. And finally, side tracking. It's a psycholinguistic method that we can use in the lab and in the field. Basically what it is there's a little camera and it shoots infrared light at your eyeballs. And by recording the way that the light is reflected back to it, it can triangulate where on, say, a computer screen or a tablet screen you are focusing. And the locations of where you're focusing are can get aligned with basically what you're hearing. So I can tell what you're looking at when you hear, for instance, the subject of the sentence. I can tell if your eyes move when you start hearing the verb in the sentence, and I can tell where they move to. So in the eye tracking while listening for this experiment, people tend to look at all the pictures that they're given pretty equally at first. So if I have 2 pictures, people will basically divide their time in half looking between the 2. But once they start hearing a sentence and they know what they're supposed to be doing at the end, their little prediction machines turn on. And once they've predicted, or once they know for sure even which picture matches the sentence, they start to focus mostly on that picture. This is true no matter what language you do this method in. So psycholinguistic work, especially field psycholinguistic work, takes a lot of people, a lot of time to put together a single experiment. So we sat down with Maestra Fe for many hours and made the auditory materials. So she had to basically speak several hundred sentences. We worked with Roque Reyes Mendoza, who is a Oaxacan artist, and he made all the drawings for the experiment. Here are some of them. So once we had them all, we had to then put these together with the audio that Maestra Fe made. We worked with participants in the village and carried out our community responsibilities. More on that later, but that's part of the community engaged fieldwork framework. And finally, people had to come and do the experiment. So over just a few weeks across these 2 summers, we had about 200 people come in and do the experiment. It took about half an hour. So that's just to sit there and do it. Not counting time spent waiting for someone else to finish, not counting time to walk, across town to get to the school where we were doing the experiment. The compensation was a flashlight and then either an umbrella or a raincoat, because Maestra Fe and community leaders in Laxopa determined that money wasn't appropriate in this context, and they recommended the alternatives. So this is just to point out that in community engaged or community-based fieldwork, researchers have to be really aware of different cultural norms about even about compensation. So in the US, when we work with people from Laxopa and neighboring villages, is fine and preferred to pay people money to work with us. But in the town, there is very little money sort of in circulation. So introducing a bunch of it to only particular people would have been the wrong thing to do, basically. So the study was run at the elementary school. The principal and parents asked that in exchange for using the space, we give English classes for the students. So the regular team members, including myself, and undergraduate research assistants like Azucena, who's in this picture here, took turns running the experiment and teaching the classes. So this is all part of our fieldwork exchange. So this is our little experiment station in the back of the elementary school. You can see the tablet there that we use to run these things instead of a laptop, which is sort of a less friendly interface in a lot of communities and less familiar as well. I don't know if you could see it because this one's really small. The eye tracker is just this little bar that's stuck basically magnetically to the bottom of the tablet. So that thing has the little infrared ray that shoots at your eyes, and then the receiver that measures where your eyes are looking. So when people sat down to take this experiment, what they would experience would go basically like this. First, you'd hear Maestro Fei saying in your headphones something like, "Here's a fox and a dog." Fox and a dog. And then hopefully you'll be able to hear this. Okay, so here's a fox and a dog. Then you'd hear, "Move the star or the leaf or the flower or the tortilla or something to the place where you see ... So there would be just a little star or something in the bottom of the tablet screen, and the task would be to push it right with your finger to the picture where you see, for example, the fox bites the dog under the tree. So this is like that sentence we talked about earlier, totally ambiguous. So there's a noun, then there's a verb, then there's another noun, and there aren't any helpful resumptive pronouns to tell us if it means one thing or the other. So this one could mean either the fox is doing the biting or the dog is. So here's our little star. So the instruction is to push it to the place where you see. Okay. So that's the sentence that we saw sort of written down just before. And then you push it to the one that you think is the best match. The box turns green when you put the star in it, and then you go on to the next sentence. Just like that. Okay. So if we think about what would happen or what should happen if the subject preference strategy is something that speakers of Zapotec are using. So the eyeballs here are representing basically the proportion of where people are looking, so to one picture or the other. So if all I've heard is move the star to where you see, I have no information, so I'm probably just checking both of them out. If I see the fox, so now I have a noun. It could be either a subject or an object based on what I know so far. If I'm using the subject preference strategy, what I'm going to do is predict that it'll be the subject, right? So I'm going to start looking more at the right side picture because the fox is doing the biting in that one. So I get the verb, everything is good so far, and then the dog under the tree. So I have no evidence that the fox is not the subject. So I'm just going to keep focusing and focusing on the side where the fox is the subject. Great. So just to be clear, this is the case where the sentence is actually ambiguous all the way through, but the subject preference strategy basically just helps us make a decision a little bit quicker. Now, this sentence at the end, just to give the end away, will be one where the fox turns out to be the object, right? The one being bitten, not the one doing the biting. But if I'm taking the experiment, I don't know that yet. So just move the star to where you see, checking both pictures out. I see the fox. This could still be a subject or an object. So I'm going to predict that it'll turn out to be the subject and start focusing more of my attention on the right side. That is biting. The verb doesn't tell me either way, so I'm still looking at the same place. The dog, everything's good so far because it's basically exactly like the sentence we saw before. Okay, but now here's where we fall off the cliff. So we get to the resumptive pronoun. The resumptive pronoun in that particular position has to be a double of the fox. And that means that the fox has to be the one being bitten, has to be the object. Okay, so my nice, prediction about the fox being the subject turned out to be flawed. And so my language comprehension machinery has to hastily reevaluate and start looking at the other picture in anticipation for choosing that picture. Okay. So what we found was that people did indeed start focusing more on the subject picture. So this is the one where the fox is doing the biting as soon as they heard the word fox. So if you have one noun and you don't know for sure what it's going to end up meaning, people do choose the word fox. And this is pretty similar to what has been found in the previous studies of, say, more well-represented languages in linguistics. And that focus didn't shift unless the fox turned out to be the object, right? So this is the second example we looked at. So unless the meaning of the sentence could only be the fox that the dog was biting. So people looked at the upper picture, the upper right picture, unless they had that little pronoun at the very end that told them, oh, my prediction was wrong. The fox is not the subject of the sentence, it's the object. So I have to look at the other picture. So everything basically happened as we expected if the subject preference strategy is in use by people who speak this language. Right? So this is nice for us as scientists. It's nice to feel like we're right about something. There is an interesting asymmetry that at least I think it's interesting. So when the sentence was completely ambiguous, participants did rapidly predict that the first noun would be the subject. You could tell by where they were looking. So as soon as they heard fox, they started looking more right at the fox subject picture. But when it came to actually making the decision, the conscious decision about what the sentence meant, so doing the task that they were told to do, the choices ended up being split about in half. So the sentence that's completely ambiguous, when we consciously think about it and what it means, people were choosing sort of both interpretations equally, even though as they were listening to the sentence, we as the researchers could tell that their subconscious sort of language machinery was really focusing in on only one of those interpretations. So it's interesting to see like the divide between what we're able to introspect about with respect to language and what is happening in our subconscious that makes those conscious feelings and thoughts happen. Okay, so to wrap up for now, we discovered that the fieldwork with Maestro Fe and other Santiago Laxopa Zapotec speakers was actually the first substantial documentation of that language. And it revealed that this particular language can play an important and I think very exciting role in psycholinguistic research. So the previous psycholinguistic research, which was on a small pretty homogeneous, pretty powerful group of languages found evidence for a kind of subconscious cognitive mechanism that makes predictions about what we're going to see or hear next as we're reading or listening. But the problem with those studies was that the mechanism might be shared only by speakers of these languages that were studied and ones that are very similar. So if this is the case, then we would have expected to not see evidence for the subject preference strategy in Santiago Laxopa Zapotec, because basically the verb initial sentence order, so the verb subject object order, and then the things that the noun verb noun sentences can mean makes it quite different to the languages that the original psycholinguistic research was based on. Okay. But what we actually found was that there is evidence that the subject preference strategy is being used by speakers of Santiago Laxopa Zapotec. So we have some evidence that this strategy is not language specific and may be shared by speakers of all languages. Of course, we haven't tested all the languages yet, so we don't know. But this is good evidence because Santiago Laxopa Zapotec is so different in such crucial ways to the ones that we previously knew about. Okay, so I will just note that there's a lot of ongoing research with the Zapotec community and in relation with linguists at UC Santa Cruz especially. And this project that I was on is just one of many. There are more actually than are listed here. There's also ongoing community engagement. So the project is making basically learning resources. So all the recordings of meetings that we have with Maestra Fe and other speakers get basically processed by us. So we cut out individual words and put them in the dictionary, cut out sentences and put them in a text database. And there are also some recorded stories about Laxopa and other stories of Oaxaca that were recorded with elders in Santiago Laxopa. And these are also in that database for people to listen to. We also made basically an alphabet with community members in Laxopa, mainly the moms who are interested in their children learning this language and keeping it, and created this illustrated alphabet chart for community use. So the same artist who made our experiment drawings made these drawings, and I love them. And our community engagement in Santa Cruz is also ongoing. So we work closely with Maestra Fe, other Zapotec speakers in Santa Cruz and in Los Angeles actually, and speakers of other Oaxacan languages. So ones that aren't necessarily related to Zapotec actually, with the goal of sharing and celebrating those languages and cultural practices of the people who speak them. So we create a lot of language learning games and lesson plans and exercises you can do, little homeworks, things like that. So Maestra Fe leads a Zapotec language class. People actually drive in and now they zoom in from a lot of places to start learning Zapotec. And at a lot of community events, we play these Zapotec language learning games and, for example, Mixtec language learning games. And the value of it is not just for the Oaxacan community, but to educate other people in the Santa Cruz community, including other people who are maybe from Mexico or have Mexican heritage and don't actually know that much about Oaxaca. So yeah, that's what we're doing. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to hear any questions you might have.
Oh, thank you so much for this wonderful and very insightful talk. I didn't really know how much work goes into an experiment like this, and the insight is just fantastic. I did, if I may, I did have a question. What piqued your interest? Why exactly this language and this region, and how did you came to a decision to really research these speakers?
It's a good question. It's largely lucky coincidence for me. So in the Santa Cruz area, there are a lot of people who immigrated from Oaxaca, like Maestra Fe, and their children who are US born. And so my professor at the time, who was in one of the pictures earlier, found her because he was looking for a language consultant for this field methods class. And so basically what he did was he put up flyers around town. And Faye, being very involved in her community and having wanted for some time to really document the language of her town, because that hadn't been done before, both wanted to do field methods, which is itself a really big time commitment for anybody, especially the speaker, but wanted for us to help her continue with the project of both researching the language, because she really values having it placed on equal footing in research contexts with languages like English and Spanish, and having something to teach, right? English and Spanish, in a sense, and really wanted us to continue with community education work, both just educating people about these languages, for instance, gently explaining to them that they are not Spanish and are not related to Spanish, and also teaching people to speak them. So I think that, okay, I don't know if that answered your question. So I think, okay, so I was drawn to Santa Cruz particularly as a incoming graduate student because I knew that this was the kind of research that I wanted to be involved with, and the professors who were teaching it were employing these sort of community engaged, community driven frameworks that I really believe in. Yeah, so I basically kind of got lucky and ended up in the right place at a really good time.
Fantastic.
Just to say thank you to Kelsey, and thank you everyone. And first of all, also to preface my my apologies that owing to my ancient laptop and risky internet connection for the delay that's actually starting today. So thank you also to Eve for jumping in and hosting at the beginning. Daniel, would you like to ask a question?
Oh, hello. I can't hear you.
You're on mute, Daniel.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the talk. That was really wonderful. I had a question about something that you mentioned at the beginning, how you were talking about psycholinguistics and fieldwork, and then it was kind of neat to see those different elements put together, but then you said, look, there's certain challenges and attention that might arise, and one has to do with technology and certain kinds of techniques that you would use that on the field, right, it might not be so successful, and one has to be really sensitive to the communities and cultural practice. And then you ended up using like pretty sophisticated technology, including eye tracking and so on. I was wondering if you could say a little more about some of the challenges that you put forth. How were you able to overcome?
Sure, that's a good question. Let me, So I think in this case, we're sort of lucky again. I mean, a lot of this, I believe, depends on having good luck. We knew we wanted to do eye tracking if possible, because we wanted to explore the potential divide between what's going on subconsciously and what ends up happening consciously, right? And the fact that Santiago Laxopa Zapotec isn't really written ended up working in our favor, because the eye tracker that you can take into the field, or the eye tracker that we took into the field, that really tiny one, is not great at tracking people's eyes while they're reading something. It just doesn't have good enough, spatial resolution to see which word you're looking at. And if you're doing eye tracking while reading, it's really important that you can tell exactly where people are looking. But since all we had to do was tell basically which side of the screen people were looking at, it worked out fine. We did sort of have to, I think a lot of the sort of cultural aspects that we had to navigate actually came when we were putting together the materials for the experiment. So we had a long list of verbs, of various actions that were going to be involved, and a lot of characters. So this was elders, regular adults. So I would say all of us here that I can see would count as regular adults and not elders, animals, and then inanimate objects. We did have to be a little bit careful about navigating what kinds of actions would be appropriate, especially between two human participants, basically. So things that elders would do to one another versus an elder and a regular human or non-elder human. Yeah, we didn't run into anything that was a huge problem in that respect, I won't say. But it was something that we were aware of, and we did have to change a few items sort of as we were putting together the experiment so that they would make sense to people who were listening. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
And I will also say we chose to use the tablet rather than a laptop because a lot of people in Laxopa have smartphones, you know, as you do. And so people would be more used to using a touch screen and looking at a little screen like that than having to confront a keyboard. There's a couple of computers in the town, like there's one at the library, but not everyone knows how to use it. So something like a tablet is actually a bit more approachable. And I will say we weren't flying completely blind on that one. So Matt Wagers, who was one of the professors involved in the project, and Sandy Chung, who is another professor now retired from Santa Cruz, worked together on a project on Chamorro, which I did mention very briefly as another language that has basically the verbs first in the sentence. They ran a similar study with the community there. So this is in the Marianas Islands in the Pacific. But a similar thing with a tablet and sort of culturally legible little pucks that you move around like a tortilla. In the Chamorro case, there were little seashells, things like that. So just choosing, like fine-tuning things so that they're familiar is something that we did.
Thanks so much. Ian, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I would. Let me so you can see me. Kelsey, brilliant. Oh, sorry, the light in my room is pretty awful. Thanks so much for your presentation, Kelsey, especially because I suspect you're not feeling totally well. Your presentation was clear, and I think I could follow it. I'm not a theoretical linguist, but I'm much more the applied literacy education end of linguistics. But your core focus was testing the subject preference strategy, and I'm just thinking you found evidence that this strategy may be, well, not necessarily universal, of course, because there's 7,000 languages to test, but you found evidence that it may be common to more languages than we expect. Now, supposing this strategy we establish eventually that it is universal even, I mean, what does that tell us? What does it matter? Or is it just a sort of interesting thing to know? Or does it tell us something deeper about the way our minds work and the way we learn?
Yep, that's a good question. So so what I'd say about learning, especially conscious or explicit learning, so things that happen in classroom settings, for instance, I wouldn't expect that this research bears directly on that. So it doesn't really link up with the pedagogical goals that we are working on with the community. In terms of telling us something deeper about, I guess, language, and about the way our minds work generally, I think it does. I think it could potentially tell us something. This is a point, I will say, at which it does become quite abstract. So the preference for the first noun or the first ambiguous noun being a subject is related to a lot of the patterns that we observe across languages, I would argue. There are many languages where the first noun in a sentence typically is the subject. So like English, you get subject, verb, object. In Zapotec, you get verb and the subject and then the object by default. There aren't many languages where the default order has the object before the subject. You can often get that order in languages, but there's something special about it, like some sort of special emphasis, as I mentioned. So I think it tells us something about the way that the human mind wants to prioritize participants in a situation that we're either experiencing or thinking about or hearing about. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Well,
but
it's fascinating in its own right, Kelsey, isn't it? You know, as we try to learn more and more about how our brains work and how we learn. But going back to something you mentioned a moment ago, I wonder if there actually is a connection with reading theory, because learning to read as a child or as an adult, it involves prediction. And so if there's a tendency for the human mind to be looking for a subject, then that maybe is worth educators knowing that as they guide children or adults who are learning to read for the first time, as they guide the learners with this process of predicting what is going to come in the sentence that they're trying to decode. Yeah, I'm also not a thoroughbred reading specialist either, but I can actually see a bit of a link there. So yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I would now like to go find an acquisition specialist to talk to you about it.
Linguistics is such a broad field, isn't it? Yeah,
it is. And I guess I'll also say that your question puts me in mind of another thing that we tested in this study, sort of a sub part of the experiment, but it was about the animacy of the basically the entities that were involved. So in this picture here, there's a regular human, that's a boy, so not an elder, and an animal. And there are findings in a lot of parts of linguistics, actually, that in addition to sort of looking for subjects in general, we're looking for the most animate thing to be the subject, or the thing responsible for the action, right? So a boy is a better candidate to be scaring someone or something than a fox is to be scaring a human. Okay. This is a tendency, but not an absolute, obviously. But it's interesting, yes, to think about how these various aspects are related and how they guide basically what we're looking for or listening for as we experience things. And this might be shaped by a lot of general world knowledge. So the things that we have experience of probably tend to be that humans are more likely to be acting on something else or something in the world than rock, for instance, or a tree.
Yeah. Can I also just comment quickly, Kelsey? I really appreciate what I would call the language development work that you're doing. You're not stopping at just theoretically studying the language, but you're actually promoting what we could call would you call it revitalization, or at least the strengthening of the language?
Yeah, I think in this case it would be a strengthening and a conservation and a strengthening project. Thank you for that. I also really appreciate that this is part of the broader project, and sort of everybody involved is really committed to it.
Yeah, that's great. I just to finish, I should explain I'm quite committed to language strengthening, shall we call it, as I'm a member of SIL, and so as you probably understand, we're very keen on helping people to develop their languages for their own community benefit and individual benefit as well. So thank you, Kelsey, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And can I just ask one final quick question? You mentioned that the future obviously part of the wider project about the Zapotec community. So what, I suppose, is next for the project, and what's next for you? Are you going to continue looking to look, or have you got another interest you're going to move on to after this project?
Excuse me. So what's next for this project specifically is actually some of it continued this past summer, because the Santa Cruzians were finally able to travel back to Laxopa and go back to the community. So there is a new installment of this study that is testing more along the lines of what Ian and I just talked about with regards to atomacy and how that affects the subject, basically how that interacts with the subject preference strategy. So the results are, I think, not all the way analyzed yet. At least I haven't heard updates, but we are sort of preparing to put the experiments that I helped run and the experiments that were run this summer, and probably at least one more summer's worth of experimental work into a publishable paper. And yeah, the broader project is going in a lot of different directions. There's now a pretty robust group working on basically the sound system of the language, which is something we, for practical purposes, had to sort of neglect for a couple of years. So the way the tone system works that I mentioned briefly, and the way the phonation system works, which is related but distinct, and also something that English doesn't really have. So there's a lot of unpicking to be done in a lot of areas. So what's next for me on this project? Hopefully I'll be back in Laxopa, if not next summer, then the summer after, to do more experiments and more community work. The rest of my research sort of in Oxford is about mostly English psycholinguistics, and it's about how we comprehend narratives. So this is be basically one paragraph, little short stories, as opposed to single sentences, which is what we were looking at in this experiment and what a lot of psycholinguistics research to date has looked at, because there's, as we've seen, a lot of pretty complicated stuff going on even within a sentence. But I think we're now at the point where we can look at sort of larger things, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm working with Daniel, who is very kindly here today to listen on a related project about single sentences and how the processing mechanisms that we apply to those sentences interact with the mechanisms that we apply to bigger narratives. So that's what I'm doing sort of now. And my hope for the more distant future of my research is that this project and the English stuff about narrative will come together, and through sort of consistent field work with Santiago Laxopa Zapotec speakers, will eventually know enough about narrative structure and narrative sort of linguistic characteristics in that language to start thinking about the same questions that I'm now thinking about in English. So it all builds on itself.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And just to thank you again, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And also I say thank you, Eve, for stepping in for me to introduce today. Next week, we actually have our next installment where I'll be back in the office with a hopefully far secure internet connection. And that'll be with Talita D'Souza Dias, who is our Shaw Foundation Junior Research Fellow in Law. We'll be looking at online hate speech and how international law relates to that. So if you'd like to come on for our next internationally inspired talk, but thank you so much, Kelsey, for starting this series for us, exploring our research around the world in the Jesus community. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us. Goodbye.